What happened next is even more interesting. You know, we all know about the Weimar hyperinflation, but to get out of it, in 1923, Germany went back to a gold-backed currency, really because they had no choice. They had some gold. They were getting some loans at that point from the United States. They were able to, their goods were so cheap that they were actually able to start to run a trade surplus and accumulate some reserves and buy some gold. And they went to a gold-backed currency, which worked. And from 1924 to 1929, Germany had the fastest growing major economy in the world. And that's one of the things that separates them from Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, we all know, had this hyperinflation. You've all seen those $1 trillion Zimbabwe dollar notes. But Zimbabwe had nothing else going for it. All it had was a printing press. It didn't have the human capital, the infrastructure, the physical capital, the transportation network, the geographic situation that Germany did. All Germany needed was a sound currency, and once they got it, their economy was off to the races. They did extremely well. So they were the first ones through it. By 1925, it was France's turn, France and Belgium. What happened then is the major countries of the world wanted to go back to the gold standard. The world had been on what's called the classical gold standard from approximately 1870 to 1914. And that was suspended at the beginning of World War I because countries knew they needed to print money to fight the war. I mean, wars are existential. You know, who cares if you print money? If you lose, you're done, so your currency goes away. And if you win, in theory, you're in a chance to dictate the peace and kind of stack the deck in your favor and repay your war debts. So either way, this is typically what countries do during wartime. But by the mid-1920s, there was a strong desire to get back to the gold standard. Well, it begged the question, at what price? What would the price of gold be in your currency if you were going to re-enter the gold standard? Well, they had printed so much money to fight World War I that France and Belgium said, well, that's easy. Gold's got to be a lot higher. It's going to be a lot more French francs and Belgian francs per ounce of gold. And that's what they did. They, in effect, devalued their currencies relative to gold, or increased the price of gold, depending on how you want to look at it, and then agreed to this new gold standard at a severely devalued exchange rate for the French franc. And I don't know how many of you have seen the new recent Woody Allen movie, Midnight in Paris, but it shows a bunch of U.S. expatriates living a very glamorous lifestyle in Paris in the 1920s. Well, that was because of the French devaluation. They had done, in effect, what Germany had done, and if you had even a modest amount of dollars in those days, you could go to France and live extremely well. But England took a different path. The Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time was an individual named Winston Churchill. And Churchill felt, whether it was duty-bound or honor-bound, to go back to the pre-World War I price. He felt that, in effect, if you were holding the currency, you were a note holder or a creditor of the Bank of England and, by extension, the United Kingdom. He wanted to honor that contract. So he insisted on going back at the rate, which expressed in dollars was about $20, $20.67 an ounce. Well, think of it this way. You start out with a parity between gold and sterling. You then double the money supply. You want to go back to parity. Well, you have two choices. You can increase the price of gold, which is what France and Belgium did, or cut the money supply in half. Churchill said, cut the money supply in half, get back to the old parity. That's what they did. This threw England into a severe depression. It was highly deflationary. Churchill later said in his memoirs it was the greatest blunder of his life, and considering he was the guy who planned the Gallipoli invasion, that's a pretty major statement. But it was. You know, to this day, I debate mainstream economists about the gold standard, and they say, so this was called the gold exchange standard, slightly different than the classical gold standard. And they say, don't you know that gold caused the Great Depression? And I say, well, of course I know that. But it wasn't gold, it was the price. They got the price wrong. If they had gone back to gold at something like $40 or maybe even $50 an ounce, which would have been an honest reflection of the paper money that had been printed during World War I, that would have been not only stable, but perhaps mildly inflationary, and we might have avoided the Depression. So when you hear an economist say that we can't have a gold standard because it caused the Great Depression, just remind them it wasn't gold, it was the price, and that was really the blunder there. Well, by 1931, it was too much to bear. England finally had to break with gold. They were losing their gold. Their currency was overvalued. People were basically coming in, saying, give me the gold. They were losing it very quickly. There was a banking panic in 1931. So England went off the gold standard in 1931, drastically devalued their currency, and it helped their economy, gave them some breathing room. Well, now, who's the last guy standing? You know, Germany, France, Belgium, UK have all had a chance. So the last guy standing is the United States. We were the last country operating with gold at the old rate. And this was the most severe period of the Great Depression for the United States. It started in 1929, but that period from 1931, 1932, was extremely bad. The deflation was overwhelming. Unemployment reached over 20%, et cetera. So finally, the U.S. cried uncle, and on his first day in office, 1933, Franklin Roosevelt did two things. The first thing he did was he closed every bank in the country. Can you imagine a president going on TV today saying, "My fellow Americans, I'm here to announce that every bank is closed. We'll get back to you when they reopen"? Well, that's what Roosevelt did. They opened about 10 days later, but it was, but they didn't know that at the time. The second thing he did was confiscate all the gold of all the American citizens. And the American citizens went along with it. Fort Knox was built in 1937 to house the gold that had been confiscated from U.S. citizens. When I say confiscated, let's put that in quotation marks. You did get $20 an ounce in paper money for your gold, so they gave you a little, little chit as you were handing in your gold. But Roosevelt knew that his plan was to increase the dollar price of gold. He wanted the dollar price of gold to go up because it was inflationary. Remember, the U.S. was fighting deflation. The president wanted inflation. And of course, gold's the gold standard, and so it affects every other commodity price. So you take gold up, it's going to take silver and cotton and oil and all those other things with it. At least that was Roosevelt's theory. So once he confiscated the gold at about $20 an ounce, he set out to raise the price. And there's a very famous story where Roosevelt's in his pajamas in his bedroom in the White House, and he calls in Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, and he says, "Henry, what do we want the price of gold to be today?" And he says, "I know, let's make it up 21 cents, because that's 3 times 7, and 7 is my lucky number." And he sent the Secretary of the Treasury out to bid out the price of gold. Morgenthau went out, called New York, and said, "Bid out the price of gold, 21 cents an ounce," and they did. And over about a 6 or 8 month period, they got it up to $35 an ounce. Now think about what this is doing to England, right? Because when the price of gold's going up, what's really happening is the dollar's going down. We're now devaluing against sterling. England was feeling the pain. Finally, they had enough. The president locked it down to $35 an ounce, a 75% increase starting from the $20 place. So here we are in the greatest period of deflation in American history, and the price of gold goes up 75%. That's one of the reasons, by the way, gold does well in deflation and inflation. So then they locked in at $35, but by 1936, it was England and France's turn again. They devalued, and then finally there was the tripartite agreement, which ended that particular currency war. But you had this sequence: 1921, Germany; 1925, France and Belgium; 1931, England; 1933, the United States; 1936, England and France again. Successive devaluations. What happened? What did we get for that? We got one of the worst periods of growth in global history. We got massive unemployment, massive contraction in trade, contraction in industrial production, deflation of a very destructive kind. It was a complete disaster. And that's how these currency wars play out. That's why this feel-good aspect of it is always less there than meets the eye.